Today I'm going to be talking about forgetting. Just a reminder, there's no chapter in the Goldstein textbook on forgetting, so instead I posted a reading on Canvas called The Seven Sins of Memory. That's going to serve as the chapter reading for forgetting. Today we're going to begin by discussing 4 explanations for forgetting. So 4 reasons why we sometimes fail to remember things. First, we need to make a distinction between available and accessible memories, and we'll illustrate this difference with an example. So I'm sure you've all had the experience when we study really hard for an exam, that is, we really make sure that we've encoded the information into long-term memory, but when we take the exam, there's a question or two on it that we simply can't answer. This type of information that's stored in long-term memory but is not retrievable, is known as an available memory. So available memories are memories that are stored in long-term memory but are not currently retrievable. Again, it's been encoded and stored in long-term memory, the information is there, we just can't retrieve it at the moment, although maybe we can recall it at a later time. We can contrast available memories with accessible memories, which are memories stored in long-term memory that can also be retrieved. So if you can answer an exam question, it's because your memory for that material is an accessible memory. You learned the information, you encoded it and stored it in long-term memory, and you can also retrieve it. Here's one last example to illustrate the difference between these two types of memories. Let's say I watched the movie Logan, and someone asks me who was the actor that played Wolverine. If I couldn't answer that question, my memory would be an example of an available memory. I have that information stored in long-term memory because I saw the movie, but I just can't retrieve the actor's name at the moment. If later on I do remember the actor's name, maybe because someone says, oh yeah, wasn't he also in Les Miserables? And now I can remember Hugh Jackman, then my memory would be an accessible memory. I have the information stored in long-term memory, and I can also retrieve that information. With this distinction in mind then, let's talk about our 4 explanations for forgetting. The first explanation is encoding failure, which says that forgetting is caused by poor or inaccurate encoding of information. To use terminology from this course, it would be like saying the information was never properly transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory, that again, it was never encoded into long-term memory in the first place. For example, think back to our discussion of levels of processing from Chapter 7, where we saw that deep processing leads to better encoding into long-term memory than shallow processing. So if we use shallow processing to try to encode some information, maybe by focusing on its physical properties, and as a result we can't retrieve the information later on because it was never properly encoded into long-term memory, our forgetting would be due to encoding failure. Here's a good example. You guys have probably seen hundreds of pennies in your lives, so you probably have no problem telling me which of these is an actual image of a real penny. Again, you've had plenty of opportunities to learn what a penny looks like, but this task is a lot harder than it sounds. Most students in my face-to-face class get it wrong. The issue is encoding failure. Even though you've seen hundreds of pennies, you've probably never taken the time to try to fully encode into long-term memory what the head of a penny looks like, and so that information is probably not stored in your long-term memory. And because I'm sure you're all dying to know, A is the answer. That's what a real penny looks like. The second explanation for forgetting is decay, which says that forgetting is caused by memories weakening and fading due to the passage of time. This is sort of the common sense explanation for forgetting, that over time information stored in long-term memory fades until we can no longer remember it. For example, Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve discussed in Chapter 1 showed that the longer the delay, the less savings he showed, or in other words, the more forgetting that occurred. The third explanation for forgetting is interference, which says that forgetting is caused by competition from old or new memories, impairing the retrieval of the desired memory. Think back to our discussion of retroactive interference and proactive interference when we discussed short-term memory. The study by Wickens showed that when you give participants multiple lists of words to remember from the same category, for example, 4 lists of different fruits, their memory for the later lists, the second, third, and fourth lists, is impaired due to interference from the previous lists, from them all being from the same category. Here are data from another study. In this one, participants learned 3 lists of words on 3 consecutive days, either in the same room or in a different room each day. The finding was that participants who learned the words in the same room, in the same context, showed worse retrieval of the second and third lists of words than participants who learned the words in a different room each day. that is in a changing context. The explanation then is that learning the words in the same room produces interference, while changing rooms eliminates that interference. The final explanation for forgetting is retrieval failure, which says that forgetting is caused by the inability to remember something because the retrieval cue isn't good enough. So according to this explanation, memories never become inaccessible, that is, they are never lost from long-term memory. Instead, they just become more difficult to retrieve. They can be retrieved, though, if the retrieval cue is strong enough. Remember our discussion of retrieval cues in Chapter 7. We said, for example, that recognition tests, where you see a list of items and have to select which item is on the study list, provide excellent retrieval cues because you don't have to generate any information on your own. And so, people may be able to retrieve additional information when they perform a recognition test on the information than if they perform a free recall test on it. For example, on an exam, you might not be able to answer a free recall question on a topic like a short answer question, but you might be able to correctly answer multiple choice question about a topic, a recognition-like question. So, to reiterate, according to this explanation, any information stored in long-term memory can be retrieved, all memories are accessible, as long as the retrieval cue is good enough. And so when you're not able to remember something, it's because the retrieval cue simply isn't strong enough. Finally, let me just point out that these explanations for forgetting are not mutually exclusive. It certainly is the case that some forgetting occurs due to encoding failure, and other forgetting occurs due to interference, etc. So it's not like one explanation is right and the others are wrong. So for the exam, you should be able to tell me which of these explanations for forgetting best accounts for the type of forgetting that occurs in an example. Next, I want to briefly go over the DRM paradigm, which was discussed in Chapter 8 in the textbook. What I'm going to do is to show you a list of words, one word at a time, at a rate of about 2 seconds per word. Normally, at the end of a list, you would then give participants a free recall test on the words from that list, but I'm going to skip this step to save time. To continue, we'll do this for 3 lists of words, and then I'll give you a recognition test for all 3 lists of words. So for the recognition test, you'll have to write down or somehow note which of the words you saw from any of the 3 lists. So let's get started. Again, I'll show you these words from list 1 at a rate of about 2 seconds per word, and then I'll do the same for list 2 and list 3. So try to remember these words. Okay, so those are the words for list 1. Here's where we would normally do the free recall test, but instead we're going to go to list 2. So here's list 2. Try to remember these words. And we're skipping the free recall test and going straight on to list 3. So remember these words. Okay, so let's skip the free recall test to go straight to the recognition test. So what I want you to do for the recognition test is to write down or somehow indicate which of these words were from any of the 3 lists I showed you. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do this. So again, somehow indicate which of these words were on any of the 3 lists. All right, let's go over this then. Here are the words that were on any of the 3 lists. But I'm not actually interested in which of these words you got right. Instead, what I'm wondering is how many of you said that these words, rough, sweet, or cold, were one of the words on the lists? If you did, you were wrong. While each list contained words that were related to these words, like sour, candy, and sugar in list 1, that list didn't actually contain the word sweet. So again, if you indicated that sweet, rough, or cold were on any of the lists, you have a false memory. Let's get this information about the DRM paradigm into your notes then. So in the DRM paradigm, participants study a list of words that are associated with a critical word that does not appear on the list. For example, sweet. So sweet was the critical word for list number 1. All of the words in that list were related to the word sweet, but sweet was not actually on that list. Later, participants attempt to free recall and recognize the words from the list, as we discussed. And then finally, the main result is that critical words are falsely remembered about 55 to 80% of the time. So even though the critical words were not on any of the lists, people quite often falsely remembered seeing them. The takeaway message then is that it's possible and actually quite easy to create false memories in people, to make people remember something that never happened. While this is a fairly benign example, the DRM paradigm illustrates that it's not the case that everything people remember is necessarily true. This is also a good example of the constructive nature of memory that we've been talking about, right? That memory isn't like a video camera, but is influenced by factors like one's knowledge, experiences, and expectations. That is, you remembered seeing a lot of words that were related to sweet, and this caused you to misremember seeing the word sweet. The last thing I want to talk about today is the focus of the reading on Blackboard. Daniel Schacter, who is a former chair of psychology at Harvard University, wrote a book called The 7 Sins of Memory, where he reviewed the common memory errors that people make. He identified 2 broad categories of errors. The first were sins of omission, which are failures to bring to mind desired facts, ideas, or events. In other words, sins of omission occur when information is forgotten and can't be retrieved from memory. The sins of memory associated with sins of omission are transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking. So again, with these sins, you are unable to retrieve something from long-term memory. The second broad category of errors is sins of commission, which occur when a memory is present but is incorrect or unwanted. The DRM paradigm that we just discussed would be an example of a sin of commission, where you incorrectly remember seeing the word sweet or rough or cold. And the sins associated with this category of errors are misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and persistence. So for these sins, there is some mistake with your memory. Anyway, these are the 7 sins of memory discussed in the reading and their definition. There's no real point in me reading these to you, and when I cover this information in class, I pretty much use the same examples as those presented in the chapter posted on Blackboard. What I want to mention, though, is the question of why we make these memory errors. That is, what should we conclude about the fact that we often succumb to these sins? Does this mean that our memory system is highly flawed, or that evolution provided us with a faulty memory system? Well, that's not what Schacter argued. Instead, what Schacter said is that the 7 sins of memory are the byproducts or the price we pay for the many desirable features of our memory system. So the fact that we sometimes fall victim to these 7 sins of memory doesn't mean that our memory system is poorly designed, but rather it has certain desirable features which sometimes inadvertently lead to a sin. They cause us to forget something or to recall something incorrectly. To briefly summarize Schacter's argument, these are the desirable features of memory, again, which are good for our memory system to have. However, these features sometimes lead to a sin of memory. Because I haven't covered these sins on the PowerPoint, let me just focus on desirable feature number 1, and you could read the end of the chapter on Blackboard for a full explanation of the rest. So desirable feature number 1 is that memory gets rid of or prevents encoding of information that is not useful so as not to clog memory. These sins, transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking, like I mentioned, are all generally about us forgetting information we had stored in memory, such as the sin of transience, which is forgetting that occurs with the passage of time. So we might think that this feature of long-term memory, that it gets rid of information that we haven't used in a while, is undesirable, as it causes us to forget things that we may want to remember. However, Schacter argues that this feature of memory is actually desirable. For instance, we talked about the interference explanation for forgetting, that forgetting is caused by competition from old or new memories, preventing the retrieval of the desired memory. The fact that our memory system gets rid of information that isn't very useful or information that happened to us a long time ago can reduce the amount of forgetting due to interference by again getting rid of memories which probably aren't that important to us. So yes, sometimes it gets rid of information that we want to be able to recall later, and when it does, the result is the sin of transience. But again, ultimately this feature of memory and the other 3 features listed on the PowerPoint are desirable, with the 7 sins of memory being byproducts of these desirable features. So that's all I have for you today. As always, post any questions you have on the discussion board, and good luck with exam number 4.